Good evening, everyone. We invite you all to post your questions, whether you are on Zoom or on YouTube. We can then take a look at both sets of questions and do our best to respond as many as we can in the time we have left. Thank you very much. So we can start now. You can shoot. Archana ma'am says, children are gone in a comfort zone. Will it be easy for the system to join back schooling? Archana ma'am, you're absolutely right. There is a certain comfort zone that children have gotten to over the last 1 year of a certain kind of routine, a different one from what they had before. So changing a routine is never easy, not for any of us. So what we are going to do, in fact, in our next session, next Saturday, is look at a range of activities and interventions which you can use to bring children gradually back to the old school routine, because it is going to be a little hard. Some children will find it easier. Some who, as you've been discussing this afternoon, will have their own anxieties and take a little longer. How do we deal with some of these children who are anxious? What are things we can do to make coming back to school easier? What are activities, strategies that we can use? This is what we're going to be doing next week. So do join us for that session. You'll have a more detailed answer to your question.
I also wanted to say that this whole issue of will it be easy for them to join school after what has been a reality so far needs to be looked at from the perspective of any situation where you are in a particular reality and you have to move into another one. For example, you have fallen ill and haven't been able to go to school for a month, or there are some difficulties in the family and you miss school for a period of time and then you have to go back to school. The crux, therefore, is in preparation and in the process of preparation. Preparation is always a process. So you envisage into the future and then you work backwards to then prepare children to go back in a way that nothing comes as a surprise to them. So this is some kind of stuff that you really need to keep in mind. That this is, of course, embedded in another question that Janab Aman Peer is asking. That it's related to online classes for a long time, and the framework that Pragya had discussed about the context, experience, inner voice, emotion, behavior paradigm. And how will we work on this through an online mode? Interestingly, someone had posted on the question and answer this business of is the world going to become paperless soon? And should we be environmentally conscious and save trees? That methodology or pedagogy is particularly interesting. And I think the online mode has come to stay. We cannot wish it away. Even before COVID, as you know, there are many agencies that specialize in offering online educational courses. So it's a question of how you use, and may I even dare say, subvert the presence of the digital world to our advantage and really use it to equip children with life skills and with thinking ability, and so on.
We have two more questions. Chanda ma'am says, how can we overcome child's boredom during this pandemic phase? One of the things is about creating alternative routines at home, because children are now expected to get online, to do online classes for a certain period of time in the day, especially older children. So what other activities can we create for children at home? If they have the ability to get out physically, can there be time for games and exercise, if that is allowed? If there are people living in cities like Bombay, this may be difficult. So if spaces are small or other families are not allowing their children to play, then what family games and family time can we create? Can physical activities be done in small ways, even in small spaces? Use of skipping ropes, a little basket that can be suspended to play basketball in a small space. So activities of that nature. And there still needs to be a routine at home for children, a wake up time, school time, so to speak, play time, TV time, leisure, time to talk to friends on the phone to maintain social connections in as much as possible, meeting with family members and relatives where possible, or at least communicating with them online or on the phone, to try and maintain all the activities and routines children had otherwise, but just in a different way. Another question, I think, that we had: how can we direct the inner voices of children during the online classes to remove the fear of the pandemic? It's an interesting question and a very important one. The reason why we all feel anxiety in context like this is because of the unpredictability or the uncertainty of the world or the circumstances we live in. And very often we think that by not giving children information, you know it's okay, because if you give information they will worry more. That is actually not true. When we withhold information about the pandemic from children, we don't tell them what is actually going on. Children have their own internal processing, as you were just discussing. They have all these inner voices that come into play, and some of their ways of processing information may not be correct, and that is what leads them to more fear and anxiety. They hear all kinds of things: people will die, you will get COVID, you can get COVID in XYZ ways. So it is important, therefore, to give them simple factual information in age appropriate ways. How you give information about COVID to a 6-year old versus a 10-year old versus a 15-year old, because of the cognitive level according to age, becomes critical. How we encourage children to be open and ask questions and do our best to answer them in ways that are truthful but reassuring. We've actually written a little story for children on COVID. So we will share that with you. Can we put that link online? We'll put that link online for you, so you can, you're welcome to read it and use it with your students in class to assuage their anxieties. It gives you a method to explain all that is happening around us. Why do we have to wear masks? Why can't we go out? What will happen if I get COVID? All the anxieties that children have, as do adults, in fact, that create anxiety.
Let me take some issues that have been put on chat as well, and try and integrate them into a composite response. Alka Pandya asks, how do we get people into disciplined lives? Someone else asks about the problem of the number of students in class, and how do we deal with them. People have spoken about smartphones, and how mentors should prepare. And with the online classes going on, uh, people have spoken about uh, the issue of examinations, and how do people master this area. In fact, Irene asks about the whole issue of malpractice, and how do you encourage students to be organized and meticulous while attending online classes. This is a question from Abha: how to deal with teenage students, and what's going to happen in the future if these online classes continue. This is Mamta's question. Let me integrate these questions into a composite response. And I had actually put this on question and answer itself a little earlier for those who are on the Zoom link, but I will say this for those who are on YouTube as well. One of the questions, dear teachers, that we have to ask ourselves, and indeed enable the parent and public system to understand, is: what is the purpose of education? What is the purpose of education? And literacy, gaining of knowledge, skills, preparation for livelihood are all legitimate purposes, We have no issues with that. They are noble and legitimate purposes. Would it be right to say that the purpose of education is to help children learn how to learn? Content is irrelevant. It's the process of learning, because most children are wired into taking content in, even given the Gaussian curve that. Or would it be more appropriate to say that the purpose of education is the development of an egalitarian personhood, the development of a socially responsive and responsible citizen, and the development of an identity that is imbued with aesthetic sensibility about the world, about nature, about people, about relationships, about compassion, about pro social behaviors, about the state of the world, and awareness of. So, to beat all this into the whole online exams and literacy and knowledge and language and malpractice and so on, it reminds me of a newspaper middle that I'd written once. I said, "Rejoice, it's examination time." Funny, isn't it? No one ever thought of examinations as a joyous experience. There's always a sense of doom, disaster, and finality around it. Whereas examinations should actually be a celebration of learning, and it never is, because outcome is prefaced over performance. Process, my friends, is more important than results, but it's never enjoyed because you have this whole pressure of performance. That so I was jokingly telling one of my friends who's the director of a set of 6 schools that why don't you have an examination mela, uh, hire a large ground. Of course, in COVID you can't do that, but I'm thinking of a post-COVID time, and hire a ground, and teachers will set up stalls, mathematics stall and English stall and history stall, and two teachers will stand at the entrance, and as students walk in, you throw rose water on them, and then they go from stall to stall, open books, create a joy about learning. That so that's a kind of composite response to really understand how you can vitalize a learning experience and create joy uh, about learning, as well as the way that we segue into what we hope is a post-COVID world 1 or 2 or 3 years from now, uh, whatever time it takes. And I suspect it's going to take that long for many cycles to go through. Well, let me come back to the Q&A on the Zoom. And there is, of course, a question and some comments. Could we focus on extracurricular activities to attract children to school with the same attitude? About losing enthusiasm in studies. There's a lot of stuff about screen time that, and there are guidelines about screen time depending on the age of the child. And this is not just about online lessons. There's the whole issue of television and the mobile phone and social media, and and WhatsApp and SMS, the whole digital world, as it were. And I think in essence, it's a question of time management. The issue is not that we can wish the digital world away, but how do we circumvent it in a way that we perhaps use it to maintain our contact with extended families? How do we use it to relax and keep our experiences of entertainment going, and also do academic work, some technical work, so that the mind, the body, and the social self are vitalized and keep activated. That so all of the questions, when Jayanti Naidu asks, are they spending too much of time in front of the screen? I think uh, the recommendation is very simple. There needs to be a family plan, democratically reached at. So the issue is not no digital time. There needs to be a family plan. And what kind of an example do family members themselves set in terms of the way that they use the digital world? That So this kind of a balance would go a long way in really addressing the kind of concerns that parents may bring to you as teachers, and some of the concerns that you yourself may have as teachers who so nobly serve the kind of children that you work with. Sheila, would you like to take some?
Um, we had an offline class this academic year, so we had no interactions and activities between teacher and student. How to change the method of teaching to make it more interesting, Swati ma'am says. Um, and this question perhaps could be related to children's experiences and their inner voices. One technique that comes to mind, or one method that comes to mind where you can make a connect with your students, is what if you had a ritual at the beginning of each session and at the end? What if you were to start your class, just 5 minutes with how people are feeling today, or share one fun thing that happened in the last few days since we met, or one thing that's been difficult. You then become a, a sort of a way for children to facilitate their emotional expression, because children don't have very many avenues. You know how difficult, you've got your own children at home, they don't see very many people, they're just stuck at home with the family. So it's so nice to have other people to talk to and share with. So what if you began every session with 5 minutes of this to set the tone, and then at the end of the session you have a ritual that you can create. You go around and say, can everybody share one word of hope that keeps us going till we meet again in our next session? So, when you create these kind of rituals, it gets children to look forward to your classes online, because you do something different and something interesting. And there is soul and emotion to your class. It's not just about getting online. So this is also a way to know what is going on with some of your children. Somebody said, how do we understand children's inner voices now online? So this is another way to know what children are thinking and what their experiences have been at home. Teachers are also a very, very important part of children's lives in terms of looking out for risks. Who knows, some child may say something that gets you thinking, what is happening in this child's family? This child said something about violence. How odd. Maybe I need to inquire. Is there abuse? Is there violence? Is something going on? Does this child need help? So teachers very often are good at recognizing these red flags because you have the opportunity. So these are some rituals you can create that also help you recognize risks and know what is happening in the lives of your students, in the emotional worlds of your students.
I'm taking an issue that's actually on YouTube. It's a very interesting issue. How do we work with tiny tots? Can you give us some? How do we use methods? And I actually put this on Q&A also, but I would like to share this with you. Some of us are very strongly influenced by the principles of anthroposophy, uh, the work of Rudolf Steiner. Now, anthroposophy is that branch of philosophy that deals with the optimization of human potential. So there is the anthroposophic practice of medicine. There is the anthroposophic approach to adults with intellectual disability as they appear in Camp Hill communities across the world. And there's the anthroposophic practice of education called the Waldorf schools. And what happens with tiny tots, particularly with what we have all collectively experienced, which is loss of ecology, both internal and external ecologies, with the lockdown and restriction of movement, and with the second wave coming and so on. If children cannot go out into the world, how do you bring the world back into the families? And for young children, preschoolers, one of the ways to do that in creative eh, is as simple as throwing a couple of coriander seeds into a pot of sand and nurturing them, and they germinate in a couple of days itself, and the joy of seeing something that you've nurtured to germinate. And this is where art and movement and creativity and storytelling and music, uh, imagination, hand functions. Because for a child, even a discarded toffee wrapper is a plaything because it has texture, it has sound, and it takes flight when you throw it in the wind. Children do not need expensive toys in that sense. They are so creative and have so much of initiative in creating stuff around themselves. That so it's a question of harnessing that potential that tiny tots have to create a world of imagination and of learning around these. So thank you very much for that question.
Taranjit Kaur ji from Bilaspur asked a very interesting question. How can we help a child when he's suffering from death of a beloved one? It's a very deep question, and we usually spend 2 days on how to work with children in the context of loss, grief, and death. Um, if you look on our website, we did a series in November. It was our Children's Day special. And we did a story about a little boy called Tariq, and centered on issues of loss and grief. One of the ways in which you can work with children is through stories. You know, you tell a story about loss and grief and so on, and then get the child concerned to talk about his or her own experience in that context and validate his feelings or her feelings, answer his or her questions on, you know, what will happen, where do people go when they die, is it my fault? So please do take a look at the story that we did for our Children's Day special. You can listen to it. You can listen to it with this child that you would like to assist, and help the child to talk about his or her loss. One of the things about working with children in loss and grief is that no one ever has time to listen to children and what they experience when a family member or a loved one dies, because you know adults are so busy processing their own grief that they forget that children also have an experience of it. And you know, you've just looked at this whole concept of a child's inner voice. What are children's inner voices in the context of loss, grief, and death? How do they perceive it? You know, is this a 5 or 6 year old who doesn't understand death? Is it an adolescent who understands death but is angry that this has happened? And therefore, to validate emotions, to talk more to them so they have the space to talk about how they feel about it using mediums like the story. You can put the link on maybe of
We're
that.
going to be putting the link on again, NIMHANS childproject.in. Many of the questions that have been put on the Q&A on Zoom and on chat, as well as the YouTube chat, if you go to this link, nimhanschildproject.in, there is a section on interventions. If you click on interventions, it says adolescence, and then 6 to 12, and then 0 to 6. And there are socio-emotional modules. There are modules on gender and sexuality. There are hyperlinks and PDF documents which have the associated materials that you can use. There are videos that you can use. And then if you go to the section on training, the aspect that Sheila referred to, which is how to deal with loss and grief issues for children, simple ways in which you can engage children of different ages through creative and fun activities, which are process-based, and which are two-way activities. These are activities that adults can enjoy as much as the children they are engaging, would go a long way to. So thank you for this enormous interest and enthusiasm by which many of you are putting hundreds of messages and comments and questions, both on the Q&A and chat on Zoom, as well as the chat on YouTube.
I saw a couple of questions on working with parents, especially on the online issue. Some people have put, how do we work with parents? Now, this is largely a negotiation process, when some parents feel that online education is not effective and that they don't want to pay school fees for a child to have this. I think it would be important to explain to parents the criticality of routine, exactly what they and you experience. What happens when there is this whole breakage of routine, which has happened already over the last 1 year. And while online classes may not be ideal and they come with their own challenges and limitations, at least it gives the child some continuity in terms of education and helps the child to keep moving. It provides a source of stimulation, intellectual and cognitive stimulation for the child. It provides a social world for your child, other children and the teachers and so on to engage with. And without this, there would be even less routine in the child's life because they'd have nothing to do all day, no constructive stimulation. And therefore, while some things are not ideal, they're the best we can do for now, and it's better
Sort of.
than nothing. So those are some things you can say to gently, negotiate and convince parents on the importance of online education. And I saw a lot more about parents. You're right that some of these webinars need to be done for parents. And we'd be delighted some of you teachers who are so innovative and have so many ideas could even get together and, as teachers, you could run a webinar for parents just like we are running for you. And should you wish to do that, you have our contacts. If you have a group of you who'd like to do it, we'd be delighted, I think, to support you to run a webinar for parents. Things that you would like parents to know, things you want to communicate to them about online education, about children, etc. We'd be happy to support you to do it. You could lead and we could assist you.
There
It's a
are a lot of
possibility.
issues that have been put on, how do you make a child more active, more open? How do we have children in class who have different speeds of learning? And, when you go, when you speak about online learning, the question that Vineet Mehrotra is putting, does it affect the thinking and learning capacity of the child? These are all related questions. And what I would like to share with you, and interestingly, someone spoke about pedagogy and andragogy and how teachers also need to look at their own andragogic processes. We always speak of intent, content, methodology, and processing. Intent, content, methodology, and processing. Whether it is a math lesson, whether it is life skills, whether it is a precept, in that 30 minutes, 40 minutes, or 1 hour that you're spending with a child or a group of children, what is your intention? आपका इरादा क्या है? उद्देश्य क्या है? If you're addressing anger, my intention as a life skills lesson is to speak about anger and anger management. What is the content? विषय हम कैसे चुनेंगे? Will the content be the context in which anger takes place? हम गुस्से को कैसे दिखाते हैं? The manifestations of anger. क्या गुस्सा जायज है? Justified versus unjustified anger. The consequences of anger. Methodology. Do I do this with role play? Do I show a movie clip? Do I get the children to work in small groups? Do I do journaling and writing? And once they present all this with their own creativity and thinking and initiative, the most critical part is processing. What did this activity mean? What did you learn from what the other person said? Are you in agreement or disagreement? What's something new that struck you as important? How will you apply some of these in your lives? This is called processing. And particularly with the whole issue and concern that many parents have about the excessive exposure to the digital world for young children, there is a difference between processed experience and unprocessed experience. If a 3-year-old kid is just sitting in front of the television, no one is sitting with the kid, and images are coming, they are just a group of amorphous images. They are not converted into information and knowledge or into language formats. Whereas if someone is sitting next to the child and saying, "Oh, wo dekho, he's eating," or "Oh, oops, it fell down," or "Oh, they seem to be a family," you're helping to process that image, even if it's a dynamic image, into knowledge and information. So intent, content, methodology, and process, we also use a term which is called meta-processing. Now, the word meta thinking is thinking about thinking. Meta-analysis is analysis of analysis. Metacognition is the cognition about cognition. Meta-processing is processing of processing. So we did an activity, many kids presented their viewpoint, which is one level of processing. And at the second level is, if we put all this together, what does it mean? What are some common things? What are unique things? So the classroom becomes a collaborative community, to quote Vygotsky, where knowledge is jointly constructed, co-constructed. So the students are not the object of your work, they are the subject. So having said that, we are coming towards the end of this first session. We have, June, another session planned with Deepika and with Pragya as well. And I see that, again, the activity level, Orient Black Swan, is absolutely fantastic from the teachers that you have so kindly invited for this session. There are over 300 and 400 questions that have come on the Q&A on Zoom and on chat on Zoom, as well as the chat on YouTube. And we are delighted that the number of participants who came on Zoom have remained constant. Usually in a 2.5 hour session, it goes from 500 to 470 to 400 to 300. And by the time we finish, there are 121 left. It is delightful, teachers, that we started with about 500 plus, and 500 plus of you have stayed. That's an indication of your seriousness of engagement and the love that you have. And this is a trick question that I often have for teachers. Do you teach because you love teaching, or do you teach because you love the subject? And it's a trick question. The answer is, I teach because I love children. And this is a manifestation of your love for the children that you so ably serve, because the role that you play in their lives could change the trajectory of their lives. And let me tell you why. A 37-year-old gentleman comes back to school 23 years after he had passed out. He's a techie in the US, and he goes back to his teacher, who's on the verge of retirement, to say, "Teacher, do you remember me?" And she looks at him through her glasses and says, "No, no, child, I don't." No, how could she? Because he was a 14-year-old cherubic, innocent-looking chap, and now he has a nice white beard and and stuff like that. But he says, "But I've never forgotten you. I don't know whether you recall, I come from a particularly difficult family background, and the truth is I'm not reconciled with my family. There was a particularly difficult day in my life at home. I don't know what it is that you noticed on my face. I still remember vividly, you did me the kindness of calling me gently aside. You didn't call me in front of other children and asked me, 'Child, is anything the matter? You appear a little preoccupied.' And I told you what the issue was. And it's not that you did anything great, but you said, 'It must have been so difficult to contain all this inside of you. I'm so happy you spoke to me. If there's anything you want to ever share in future, don't hesitate to to call on me.' And teacher, I have never ever forgotten that act of kindness. Dear teachers, I cannot tell you the kind of role that you can play in changing the trajectory of children's lives, even by one statement on one given day. That's the kind of impact, because children remember.
Here is Dr. Shekhar, who's with us once again. So let's begin with some questions that we see. That's an interesting one. How can we memorize children the number of rivers in India in class 9? There is a technique called mnemonics, which is how do we, help children remember things. I remember when I was in grade 4 or 5, how we learned the 9 planets. My very elegant mother just sat upon 9 porcupines: Mercury, Venus, Mars, that's the planets. So I wonder whether you can create things like that for rivers. If you can have a mnemonic for each part of the country, the letter that the river starts with, and have a funny sentence like this that children can remember.
It's it's
These are techniques you
it's
can
it's very
use.
it's very well known in medical training, particularly when you try to remember the cranial nerves. Our old oak tree takes away fresh air, giving very shady homes. Our occipital oak tree, yeah, trigeminal, takes away abducent, leaving, and so on and so forth. So these are known as mnemonics, mnemonics, mnemonics. That so
I see a couple more questions. How to improve the attendance of students in the online class? That is just the activities we were doing today. If every class can have a surprise, like the melting ice cream, the first 5 minutes where you do something interesting, an English class where we write a letter to Corona, or a Hindi class, any language class where we write a letter to Corona, because we are also learning and we are using it to do an interesting activity. So today's activities can be adapted as part of your subject learning, or to do them in the first 10 minutes or the last 10 minutes, because then children feel that there is something to get online for. This teacher is different. Something fun always happens on this online class.
करो डियर
So,
डियर करोना तुमसे प्यार नहीं है.
right? How can we overcome the stress we are facing because of the news channels? Friends, the only way is to shut off. And some of the things that Deepika, June, and Pragya discussed with you today to do with daily routine is precisely that. We cannot spend all day looking at our gadgets and keeping up with the news. So, if that routine, whether it is your own routine as teachers, or whether it is for children, to have perhaps 10 minutes in the morning where you check into the news, because we need to know what is going on by way of curfews, lockdowns, and so on, so that we can make the necessary life changes. And maybe 10-15 minutes in the night to see what is happening again, to touch base with the news, but not to follow it constantly on and on. This would be the only way, because, as I think you rightly mean, following the news all day long can create greater anxiety. It can also be very depressing and prevent us from doing the activities we need to do to carry on with our daily lives.
It's a time balance between a time management and a processing issue as well. How do you help children actually process what they hear or what other people tell them, to give them a balanced thing? That, yeah, there are lots of opinions, but as long as we carry out some of the basic principles that have been taught to us about, particularly in the time of COVID, that, when you use, generally, how we practice hygiene in any case, COVID notwithstanding. So there are some basic principles that you follow. Keep it simple and keep it elegant.
About COVID affected students, and many students have lost their interest. How do we help them regain motivation? Again, this could be a simple exercise that is done using some of the techniques we have taught you, such as close your eyes and imagine 5 years from now, where do you see yourself? My dream, my aspiration. Because, we are living in times where all of us, and children in particular, because of the many stresses we experience, need a reminder about, things we dreamt of, plans we made, things we wanted to be, because everything looks pretty tough now. And to say that, 5 years from now things may be different, 2 years from now they will be different. So to do some of these envisioning exercises and have children share, it's a great exercise to do in the first 10 minutes of your online class. What do you want to be? Do you remember what you want to be when you grow up, or 5 years from now? And then connect it to what we are doing today and say, part of what we are doing today is to help you to achieve that dream 5 years from now.
It's called a Future Search Conference. Interestingly, the corporate and profit-making agencies know this. 10 years from now, if you wanted to double your profits, what should you be doing 8 years from now, 5 years from now, 1 year from now, 6 months from now, tomorrow? And this Future Search Conference, to really envisage and imagine a time 10 years from now and then work backwards towards that is a fantastic aspirational activity that one can experiment and very creatively with.
Major challenge is to make students keep the cameras on. What should be done to ensure that they come on screen? And teachers, well, again, there could be a fun way to get them to turn their cameras on. Have them do some face painting, maybe, and come on screen with an interesting face that you want to show everybody. It could be funny, it could have an expression, perhaps they could even make a mask. You can tell them that in the previous session and instruct them and say, I'd like everyone to wear an emotion or be an animal, and to make a simple mask, not more than 15 minutes needed. Wear it because everyone wants to see it next time. So there could be ways like this to motivate children and keep things light in times that are very stressful and difficult.
A light touch is हल्का हल्का सा जो touch है, नजाकत जिसको कहते हैं, light touch is always very good. Sometimes when we work with issues and challenges and people, it can get a little heavy, the more complex and difficult a situation is. And if we have a framework with which we actually approach a problem, a context, a challenge, but use a light touch, it makes it that much more holding and comfortable for a child in the kind of interactions that you're having with the child.
Somebody mentions that students who are going to appear for the exams test COVID positive, etc. You now have the Anni and Addu story.
Yep.
And you know how to manage children's anxieties about COVID. Remember what it says: if you get it, stay home, drink lots of warm liquids, eat well, watch your favorite cartoons, and relax. Because stress and immunity are also very related issues, as many of you, I believe, would be aware. The more stressed and worried you are, the poorer your immune system becomes, and the more vulnerable you become to any kind of infection. So the key is to relax and know that there are ways to contend with things when things happen. Easier said than done, of course, because we are surrounded right now, at least this week, by terrible news from around the country about oxygen supplies and shortages and hospital beds. But all the more reason then to say, if you follow the SMS ways, that the story talks about, if you have your daily routine, you stay home and find ways to keep healthy, these are ways in which we can prevent it in as much as possible, right? How to manage time with the syllabus. If every day time is spent on an activity, we are not suggesting that you spend 2 hours on an activity, but we are just saying spend the first 5 minutes and take 5 or 6 responses, and the last 5-10 minutes of the class, because it'll be worth your while.
In any kind of pedagogy for these activities, as Sheila points out, this whole issue of anticipation, that, and even if it is 5 minutes, if you create a memory around it which people will remember 5 years 10 years from now कि ये मुझे याद है वो 5 मिनट ही करते थे लेकिन it was our motto or it was a song that we coined during these times that it became the symbol of this time that we spent together, and we wrote the words and we gave it the tune. So it creates a sense of community and of social cohesion. It creates a memory. It also creates a holding environment and a scaffolding for kids to put a hook on. And as Sheila points out, it need not take an inordinate amount of time. Even if you do it as for 5 or 10 minutes, it is meaningful, and it is engaging, and it is reassuring and relaxing.
How can we deal with students who leave the meeting when they're called? In fact, there are students who've never spoken for the whole year. How do we help such students? We have a couple of different responses to this. One is the students are there, but they don't speak, in which case these 5 minute, 10 minute activities can be really helpful. The idea is not, dear teachers, to harass and harangue them and say, you have to speak, but to just call out and say, why don't you tell us, one good thing that has happened in the last week, or one fun thing that you have done. So it doesn't, if you call upon them to speak at length, it may be difficult, but even to say, one sentence and to be gently encouraging. The other response we have is, if they are not appearing in your online sessions at all, you may have to do more than this. You may have to give them a call and set up a meeting with them to ask what is happening, because we don't know what is happening in children's homes. You remember last week you did the activity on children's emotions and behaviors. So do recall that. Why does a child not come to the online session at all? Is something happening at home? Are there serious seriously difficult and stressful issues? Is there no connectivity? Are parents fighting? Is the situation impossible for the child to focus on the class? Is the child overwhelmed with anxiety? Has this child got into a sort of depression because he or she has lost a family member? Some of you mentioned loss last week. So we really need to then do a deeper level of conversation with such children to find out, because you teachers are our frontline workers where children are concerned. You are the first to know that something is not right with the child. And now more than ever before, it is important to play that role. What is the risk that this particular child is being exposed to? If you find out, perhaps you can assist that child or link that child to psychological assistance.
Sheila, there's a very important issue in the context of the term loss that you used, which has actually come up, that
Mhm.
how do you work with or comfort a child who has suffered the loss of a parent
Mhm.
in this terrible pandemic that we are in the midst of? That, and dear teachers, loss and grief is something that Samvad has worked extensively on. And in fact, if you look at the resources that we gave you last time, which is the website www.nimhanschildproject.in, and if you go to the section on training, and there is there are three modules, one of which is on working with loss and grief. You will find simple ways of working with children, and we put it on chat. But Sheila, some thoughts from you on how do you comfort a child who has, and mind you, it depends on the age. Are we talking about a 6-year-old? Are we talking about a 9-year-old? Are we talking about a 14-year-old? So age makes a lot of difference about how children actually experience and conceptualize loss. And is it a sudden loss? Is it a protracted kind of an experience that the child has had?
Where young children are concerned, you would find a couple of stories on our website.
Yeah.
There is one about Tariq and his fish. So, how do you work with younger children on issues of loss? So you could actually use that story with children and talk about the idea of loss, and it has concepts about death, about how it's not your fault. It's very, very relevant, this story, especially in the COVID time, because it talks about a fish that died because of illness. There are big illnesses, there are small illnesses. Small illnesses are like when you have a cough and cold, and you take some medicine, you drink warm things, and you recover in a few days. You have bigger illnesses that last for many years in our lives. People who have diabetes and hypertension, issues like that, for which they need to take medicine every day to be able to keep their health. And then you have some sicknesses where, doctors try their best and they're not able to cure the person, and then these people are not with us anymore. So, to help them to distinguish also that not all illness and sickness is the same. Similarly, if you had to apply it to the COVID scenario, COVID does not affect everybody in the same way. People who are very old, because they're already weak and may have other illnesses, COVID, affects them in certain ways and they may not survive. People who already have illnesses of some kind, we don't know, and that's why they don't survive. So it's not true that everybody dies of COVID. It's important to give these messages when we talk about loss as well. And another type of response, of course, which is very critical, is um, to reassure children that you are there to support them, that you understand that it's a very difficult time, and that if they want to talk about the person they lost, could be a caregiver, it could be a friend, it could be a close relative, that you are there to listen and to comfort. Because dear teachers, there is no short answer, as we all know. Loss and grief are perhaps the most universal
It's a,
experiences, COVID or no COVID. We all have them in various ways. It's just that COVID has propelled the issue into, the forefront, and we really are confronted with it now. So to allow children a space, because many times we tell children in the context of loss, um, oh, that's okay, these things happen, you will forget, you need to focus on your future. One doesn't know whether these are really helpful responses. Are they even helpful to us as adults? And if not, how do we expect children to process some of these very complex issues? And therefore, the need to create a space just to listen and comfort, because children often don't have the space to share grief. And if you can create that, I think you would be making an enormous difference in their lives.
I would just like to add to this, and just as loss and grief are universal experiences, they also are unique for that child, given the context of the child's age and the nature of loss and the person that the child lost, and what that person meant to the child, and to allow, as Sheila pointed out, that child the space to articulate the experience that he or she has endured and gone through, and have the reassurance that it has been heard with respect, and responded to with a validation of the emotional essence that the narrative carries. That
As a maths teacher, I have to create more interest as well as ensure that the drill work goes on properly. Any advice? Manohar sir, if you are teaching older children, especially high school kids, you may want to use the COVID numbers and data to teach a lot of mathematics. You may want to connect what is happening around children, which is why they're disinterested and preoccupied, to mathematical concepts. And that is life education. You're connecting what is happening around them to actually teach concepts, like whether they are graphs or numbers or problems. They can be about oxygen cylinders, they can be about hospital beds. You could use that kind of creativity possibly, so that children see things differently. What measures can be taken to remove the fear of pandemic from the minds of children? I think we've spent the last 2.5 hours looking at this,
yeah the
starting from the story
yeah
itself.
the issue also is not just removing the fear of the pandemic, but it's also putting other experiences, positive experiences, aspirational thoughts, plans, activities. So if consciousness is like a container in which fear of pandemic is one. It's like the basic laws of chemistry. If a molecule of gas is put in a fixed container, it expands to fill the place. But if you put other chemicals, then the relative space that it occupies becomes less. That so yes, there are methods to remove the fear of pandemic, but you also reduce the space that the fear occupies in consciousness by putting other experiences, other thoughts, other creative aspirations into the reservoir of children's consciousness to then balance the kind of fear that the pandemic actually causes. More than anything else, dear teachers, one of the important concepts that we've been speaking about is called intolerance of uncertainty. And this fear is actually related to an intolerance of uncertainty. And it's interesting that if you ask any human being, how far into the future have you predicted your life? And and someone may say, I have made plans for 10 years, or I have made plans for the next 1 year because my graduation is over and I've already registered for this online course. But if you ask this question to a stockbroker, he will say 2 seconds, because my life can come crumbling if I make a bad investment. That So it is this fear of intolerance of uncertainty that really structures the kind of fear that we have, because the truth is that no one really knows how the pandemic is going to really pan out. That so that's how you really handle the kind of fear of uncertainty that and fear that children have.
Okay. Also, I wanted to add, um, it's not just about removing the fear or anxiety, it is about addressing fears
Fear.
and anxieties. And that has been the emphasis of a considerable part of today's work, especially the COVID story. We all fear and feel anxious about what we do not know, what we cannot predict. And therefore, when we are given factual information in ways that are reassuring, that's when we feel reassured. Children are not different from adults. So it's the fear of the unknown. That's why we wrote that story, to explain COVID to children, so that the information is provided in simple, creative, and non threatening ways to help them understand the pandemic. That's one key way to reduce anxiety, as I'm sure Deepika and Pragya and June
June.
mentioned earlier. Children are always hearing bits and pieces of adult conversations, and therein lies the danger. So they put two and two together, not always to make four.
22.
So they made, to make 22. And then their internalizations are not accurate, and that is what serves as a source of anxiety, when they understand things incorrectly and then start to worry about them. So it's important to set the facts straight and give them information. All right. um, Somebody put a question about how do we deal with challenging students online. um, Dealing with challenging students is very challenging, both online and offline, and the answer is very similar to what we said earlier. I don't know what the challenges are, but if you see behavior problems, if you see inattentiveness, you see aggressive behavior perhaps, it's time to have a separate conversation. Not all discussions can be addressed in the online classroom, just like not all discussions can be addressed in the in person classroom. You may have to call for a parents' meeting on the phone or online to discuss what is going on at home with the child. Because now from the whole inner voice framework that we discussed last week, that every behavior, every challenging behavior particularly, has behind it an emotion. And behind every emotion, there is the inner voice of the child. How the child thinks and understands things. Where does that come from? That comes from a difficult experience which occurs in a certain context. So if you apply that framework, and you contact the parents and the child to say, these are my observations, what is really happening at home or with the child. You may need an interview with the child and with the parents, same as you would do when you were in school, right? Just like you teachers call parents to say, the child isn't doing well or is something going on, same
तो
way.
ये ढांचा जो है बहुत महत्वपूर्ण है। ये हमारा मंत्र अगर हो जाए, संदर्भ, अनुभव, अंतर्ध्वनि, भावना और व्यवहार। हर व्यवहार के पीछे एक भावना है, हर भावना के पीछे एक अंतर्ध्वनि, हर अंतर्ध्वनि के पीछे एक अनुभव और हर अनुभव के पीछे एक संदर्भ। संदर्भ, अनुभव, अंतर्ध्वनि, भावना और व्यवहार, इस इस मंत्र को हम हमेशा दोहराते रहें तो हमारी प्रतिक्रिया जो हमारे छात्र के प्रति होगी किसी भी संदर्भ में, चाहे वो चैलेंजिंग स्टूडेंट्स हो, it's a framework that always using the lens of frameworks makes it easy for us to kind of generate responses which are proactive and leading to.
There's another very interesting and pertinent question that Vaishali ma'am puts. In the next academic year, some children may have acquired necessary competency levels. What can be done for those who are not prepared at all due to many reasons? Ma'am, I think you have really hit the nail on the head. And this is the concern as far as education is concerned. What happens, when children have not learnt adequately? Um, I think one of the things is when the new year comes and we don't know what the new year will bring, whether it's going to be another year of online education, because that's how it appears currently with the second wave of COVID. That's where we are
Yes.
headed. One is to do some systematic assessments on where the child is, what the child has achieved or not been able to achieve academically. For younger children, it may have to do with reading and writing skills, for example. If looking at the level of deficit, depending on the level of deficit, one may decide whether to let the child continue at the higher level and provide the additional supports that are required, whether they're in the form of bridge classes, etc. We may have to consider those. The government already does a lot of these across the country. Even in pre-COVID times, we have what are called bridge classes to help children catch up. Children who are understimulated, children who have joined school at a late age, and so on. But if the learning is at a very rudimentary level, then the bridge classes may also not be appropriate. In that case, it may be wiser to leave the child in the lower level, the lower class, to continue until certain skills are acquired.